Hello guys, welcome back to the channel, and for today's video we are going to be talking about switch port security. In this video we are going to be talking about how port security is applied in the workplace and also what the best practices are when using port security at work. I'm also going to show you the port security CISCO commands and a home lab example so you can try it out in Packet Tracer at home. And also the verification commands that we can use to test out that port security works. So if you're interested in today's video, please keep on watching, and without further ado, let's get started. Of course, implementing network port security is essential in the workplace. It's not enough to just set up our switches at work with configurations, but we also have to secure our network as well. First of all, we would like to protect our network from unauthorized access, and we don't want users to be bringing in some rogue devices that they just can plug into the network and risk the security of our network. And also in my workplace, we apply port security because we don't want the users to be moving around the computers just anywhere they like, because it's really hard to keep track of the assets. Because where I work, the host name of the computer is usually the room number. So if users swap the computers because something is not working, which happens a lot of times, it'll be really hard to track those devices. So we would like to lock our port to just one machine that is assigned to the room. And there's a lot of ways in how we can secure our network. We can implement VLANs, which segments the network access and resources based on user control and permissions. We can also encrypt network traffic and enforce strong authentication. But in this case, we are going to be talking about enabling port security in our switch ports and disabling unused ports. Okay, so for best practices for port security at work, so let's start with the simplest one to implement is to disable unused ports. For example, if there's empty offices or cubicles in the workplace that is not being occupied for a long time.
Also, another example at work is when we set up an access point for guests or visitors. When we're not using the access point, we usually just shut down the port. And then when we set up the access point, we just re-enable the port and disable it again after we use it.
Also to prevent unauthorized access, and that's the easiest and simplest way you can implement port security. So the way to do it is just go onto the port interface and get the interface number and to just do a shutdown command on the switch port. That way, even if they plug anything, any rogue devices or any company assets, you'll still not have access because the port is down. Next best practice is to enable port security, which we can use the features like MAC filtering and port lockdown. So this is a more complicated process because you have to configure more commands to it compared to just disabling the unused ports. So let's get started talking about enabling port security.
Okay, so moving on, if you're gonna enable port security in your switch ports, you should know which security mode you're gonna use. So there's 3 security modes or port security modes. It's shutdown, protect, and restrict. So the shutdown mode is the default mode, and in this mode, if there's an unauthorized device that was plugged into the switch port, the port will immediately be disabled or shut down, and it won't be re-enabled unless you manually re-enable it. Okay, so next will be the protect mode. So in this mode, the switch port will permit the traffic from known MAC address, the MAC address from your network, and it will drop the traffic from unknown MAC address. And in this mode, there's no notification messages that will be sent if the violation happens. And for the restrict mode, it's the same with protect mode, where it will permit the known MAC address and drop the unknown MAC address. But the difference is that it will send a notification if a violation happens. Also, port security has a MAC filtering feature that allows you to specify how many devices that you can allow on the switch port, and also specify and assign the specific MAC address for the device that you're gonna allow in the port. So you can set the maximum number of ports that you can allow to 132. So in setting up MAC address to your port for port security, there are also different ways to do it, and the 3 ways are doing it statically, dynamically, and using MAC address sticky. Okay, so for static, you can type in the actual MAC address of the machine that you wanted to be allowed on the switch port, and that static MAC address will be stored in the running configuration, and you can save it to the startup configuration if you wanted to save it permanently. For the dynamic, this is learned by connecting the device to the switch port. So the first one that you plug into the switch port is the one that will be dynamically learned by the switch, so you won't have to type in the actual exact MAC address for the machine. The switch will just learn it dynamically. So these MAC address will only be saved to the MAC address table, and then when the switch reboots, you will lose everything that's stored in that address table. Okay, so for the third one, it's the MAC address sticky. So this is a hybrid, and this is like a combination of dynamic and static. The difference is that you don't have to type in the MAC address statically or manually. The MAC address will be learned dynamically, and then the address will be saved onto the address table and the running config that you can save later on permanently if you want on the startup configuration. So most companies, especially in my company, we use MAC address sticky because it is more tedious to do the static way when you have to type in everything manually. So at least this is dynamically learned, and then we can just save on the configuration in the startup config if you wanted to store it there permanently. Okay, so this is an example of a homelab that you can do in Packet Tracer to practice port security. So it's very simple. We just need a switch and a few computers in here to connect and enable the port security. And also we need some extra computers like a laptop, for example, or a PC in here that can act as a rogue device. So before we enable port security and configure the switch with the commands, I just want to show you what the default port security looks like. So I'm just gonna go on the switch and get into our privilege exec mode and type in a command to verify port security, which is show port security. And if you type and enter, nothing will show because we haven't enabled port security on any ports in here yet. And another way to see what the defaults are like, we can add in interface in here, and then interface number, for example, FA01 is our first port. So as you can see in here, the violation mode is shut down because port security violation mode default is shut down. So you really don't have to set that up or enable it. So for this lab, we are going to have a few different scenarios or situation where we can use the port security features. And when we are configuring this, we are going to use the different parameters like the maximum value that you can allow on a switch port, and then the switch port security mode, which are the violation like shutdown, protect, and restrict. And of course, how we will set up the MAC address in different ways like statically, dynamically, or using MAC address sticky. So for the first scenario, we are going to set up the device MAC address as static, and then the violation mode would be protect. So just to take note before we start configuring the switch with port security, that port security is disabled by default, so you have to manually enable it by using commands. And also, you can only configure port security on access ports. You can't do this on trunk ports or ether channel ports. Okay, so for the first scenario, we would need to set up the MAC address statically here, and we can do it on this first PC and on this first interface, FA01. So the first step is for us to find out what the MAC address of this computer is. So we can click on the computer and go to the config tab in here, and on the left side there's fast ethernet, and when you click on that, that's where you can see the MAC address, and that's how you can find the MAC address for the PC. Okay, so let's do the commands now. So let's go to the switch and then type in enable, get into configure terminal, and then type in the interface number, and that would be FA01. And now that we're here, just make sure to type in switch port mode access first, just setting up our interface as an access port. And then the next command is to enable port security. So you should type in switch port security and press enter. There you have enabled port security. And then the next parameter that we are gonna do is to specify how many maximum machines we're gonna allow on the switch port. So the command will be switch port security maximum, and you can type in from numbers 1 to 132, which is the maximum. So for here, let's just say 2. We are allowing 2 and press enter. So for the next parameter, we can specify what kind of violation mode we want. So since shutdown is the default, we really don't have to type in shutdown if that's what we're going to use. But since we're using protect, we have to explicitly type it in. So type in switch port security and violation, and then type in protect because we wanted to specify that we want to protect, and press enter. So that's for the security mode. So next is, since we're gonna do a static method in here for the MAC address, let's type in the command switch port security MAC address and the MAC address of the machine. So earlier we looked it up, and let's open it up again. So it should be in the config fast Ethernet, and let's just look at it side by side. So what you can do is copy and paste it here just to make it easier. Alright, and press enter. So I think I've already tried setting it up earlier. I just wanted to show you how, but yeah, if there is a duplicate, it would tell you, but that should work now for this port. And what we can do next is to verify if our command works. So we have switch port security verification commands as well. So we can exit out on this modes, and when we're back to the privilege exec mode, you can type in show and port security interface and the interface number FA01, and it should show us that port security is now enabled. Port status is secure up, and we have set up protect for the violation mode, and also the maximum MAC address now is 2. Earlier the default violation mode was shutdown and maximum MAC address was 1. So now it has changed because we have enabled port security. Okay, so I also assigned IP address on these machines because we're going to be pinging them just to see if they can communicate with each other. So there's no reason why they can't. So they should be able to talk to each other for now because they're not violating any security mode in here. Okay, so another verification command aside from the one that I showed you earlier is to do a show port security. Okay, so just show port security and press enter, and it will show you how many port security was set up. So for now we only have 1 for the first port, and it will show you the details like how many MAC address is allowed, how many violation happen, and what security action or security mode that it's using. So for now, for this port, it's the protect mode, so it will show in there. And okay, so another verification command that we can use in here is show port security address, and it will show you the MAC address that was saved on the MAC address table. So you can see in here the MAC address and which port it's configured with. So those are the 3 verification commands that we can check if port security is working. Okay, so let's now move on to the next scenario. For example, we want to use MAC address sticky instead of typing the MAC address manually, and we also want to do a shutdown violation in here. So we are gonna do it on this next PC in here, and on this interface should be the second interface. So what we are gonna do is the first step to enable port security. So let's go and to conft type in the interface number, which is FA02, And then just make sure that this is an access port. So I'm gonna type in switch port mode access, and then type in switch port security. Enter to enable port security in here, and then we want to do a switch port MAC address sticky. So switch port security, then type in MAC address, and then just type in the word sticky. And this is what we are gonna type instead of actual MAC address of the machine. And press enter in here. And since shutdown is the default for port security, we don't really have to type it in the violation mode. Okay, so what we can do is to do the verification commands. So if we type in show port security interface and the port number, which is FA02, we can see that the port security is now enabled and violation mode is shut down. Even if we didn't explicitly type it, it should be the default, so we don't really have to do that command. And maximum MAC address is 1. Okay, so that's accurate. And then we can also use the other verification commands. Next is show port security. And as you can see, now we do have 2 ports in here that are enabled with port security. Earlier it was just 1. Now we have 1 for the first and second interface. And as you can see, there's a difference with the security action or security mode in here and the maximum address. So that's how you can check if you have enabled port security and it works. Okay, so we're just gonna ping the other machine just so that the switch can learn what the MAC address of that machine is. So after pinging, let's go back to the switch and type in the next verification command, which is show switch port, show port security address. And as you can see, there are now 2 MAC address in here, and you can see the type, which is how we have entered the MAC address. So in here, if it's secured configure, it means that it's static, and you can see that this one is sticky because it was dynamically learned. So that's the 3 verification commands that you can use to check port security. Alright, so let's test it out now if our port security in here works after verifying it. So we do have like different machines in here that can act as like rogue machines, for example. So what I'm gonna do is to connect this PC in here into the second port and see what's gonna happen, because in this PC we only allowed 1 device to permit traffic in the switch port. So okay, so let's see what's gonna happen if I'm gonna connect a different machine to the second interface in here. So I removed it from this computer. Now let's plug it in and connect it to interface 2. And as you can see, the indicator light becomes red immediately because our violation mode in here is shut down. So it won't be able to talk to any computers. Port is automatically shut down because that is the violation mode. So let's go and check on the switch in here. So we can use the verification command show port security interface, and then the interface number FA02. And as you can see here, we have security violation count number 1 because this is the first time that that was violated, and it has a record in here now that there's a violation that happened. So that's how you can check on it, and I think that's how you can really test that port security works. Okay, so what if we plug in the actual machine that we have allowed in here and see what's gonna happen to the second port. So as you can see, it is still showing the red indicator light, which means that, like what we talked about earlier, if the port was shut down because of the violation mode, we have to re-enable the switch port manually. Okay, so we have to manually enable it, re-enable it. So let's do a shot in here and then a no shot. Okay, so if that happens, that someone has plugged it into a port that has port security set to shut down, that's what you're gonna do. set it manually to shut down first and then change it back to no shut after. And as you can see, the light is changing in here to green. It means that it has been re-enabled. Okay, so what you can also do if you are trying to enable port security on multiple ports in the switch is to do a range. So if you go to configure terminal, type in interface, range, and the port where you will start enabling the port security, for example, FA03 until the last port that you want to enable port security, for example, 10. So that's it. You can enable it on multiple ports with just one single command, so you don't have to do it on all of the ports, especially if you have a lot of ports, like 72 ports in the building or more. At least in here you can do it all at once. So just type in the same commands: switch port, port security, violation, protect, for example, and then switch port, port security, MAC address, sticky, because you want it the same for all of the ports. So that's an easy way to enable port security. Okay, so that would be it for today's video. I hope you learned something. I hope you learned the different commands that you can use in enabling port security, and also the different methods in setting up the MAC address, the different security modes, and the different parameters that you can use in port security, and also verification commands. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to leave it on the comment section below, and I hope to see you guys in my next videos. Thank you so much for watching.